Book 6, Chapter 4, Part 3 of the History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Angie Liu. The History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 2 by Charles LEA. Book 6, Practice, Chapter 4, Part 3. The Secret Prison. It would be manifestly unjust to condemn as a whole the management of the prisons. It would be equally unwarranted to praise them indiscriminately. Everything depended on the conscientious discharge of duty by the inquisitors, and no general judgment can be formed as to the conditions of so many prisons during 3 centuries, except that their average standard was considerably higher than that in other jurisdictions, and that, if there were abodes of horror, such as have been described by imaginative writers, they were wholly exceptional. There were good and there were bad. The memorials of de Rina and Jaen, in 1506, described them as horrible dens, overrun with rats, snakes, and other vermin, where the wretched captives sickened in despair, and were starved by the embezzlement of a large portion of the moneys allowed for their support, while no physician was permitted to attend the sick, and the attendants maltreated them like dogs. Making allowance for rhetorical exaggeration, we can imagine that this description was applicable to Cordova under Lucero. Matters seem to have been not much better at Seville in 1560, where the oppression of the alcaide, Gaspar de Benavides, provoked a despairing revolt in which his assistant was mortally wounded. Vengeance was wreaked on the participators in the fray, of whom one Avis burnt alive, and another, a boy of 14, had 400 lashes, and was sent to the galleys for life, while Gaspar, who had provoked it, was let off with appearing in an auto da fe, forfeiture of wages, and perpetual banishment from Seville. When malfeasance in office escaped with such ill-judged leniency, it was impossible to maintain discipline, and the prisoners suffered accordingly. As the result of an inspection of Barcelona by Dr. Alonso Perez, the alcaide Montserrat Pastor is scolded, in 1544, for keeping a mistress in his house, for placing a kinsman in charge of the prison and absenting himself, for receiving presents from discharged prisoners, for frequent absence, leaving the prison unguarded, for combining the incompatible positions of jailer and dispenson, and of making the women prisoners work and taking their earnings. But Pastor was only reprimanded in order to restore the presents and the women's earnings. Virtual immunity invited continuance of abuses, and in 1550, after another inspection, we find the Suprema again adverting to the evil result of combining the functions of jailer and dispensero, and ordering the inquisitors to fill the latter position. The prison of the Canary Tribunal at times seems to have been equally mismanaged. An Englishman named John Hill was brought there from Ferrol, June 23, 1574, with nothing but his clothes, and no money. For 9 months his complaints were loud and frequent. A day's ration was insufficient for a single meal. He begged for more bread and water, also for a mat to lie on, as he had to sleep on the ground, and he could not rest for the lice and fleas. For more than 2 months he prayed for a shirt to cover his nakedness, and though an order was issued January 22nd to give him one, it had to be repeated February 18th. Even as late as 1792, Don Juan Perdomo complained that for 14 months the alcaide had kept him on a diet of salt fish, that he would allow him to change his linen but once a fortnight, and that he caused him to suffer such torment from thirst that he would go into the courtyard and cry aloud, hoping that some passer-by would summon the alcaide. Yet other passages in the Canary record show a praiseworthy desire to alleviate the rigors of confinement, and in general it may be said that the conditions of the prisoners depended wholly on the temper and character of the officials in charge. When these were kindly, the prisoners were spared unnecessary hardships. Francisco Ortiz in 1529, at Toledo, bore willing testimony to good treatment which he had not anticipated. In 1563, Fernando Diaz, a peasant, after a month's detention in Toledo, speaks of improved health. Here, he says, he has mutton to eat, while at home he had only sardines. In 1567, a member of the Suprema, visiting the prison of Valladolid, was told by Leonor de Cisneros that she had nothing to complain of. She had mutton and bread and wine and fruit and was well treated. As she was a relapsed, whose husband had been burnt 8 years before, she probably had no property, and the expense was defrayed by the tribunal. These are by no means isolated instances. In 1541, at Toledo, Juan Garcia, a day laborer on trial, after 6 weeks in prison, asked that night clothes be given to him as to the other prisoners, as he was obliged to sleep in the garments worn during the day, when the inquisitor at once ordered him to be supplied. In 1657, the accounts of the Tribunal of Madrid show 447.5 reals spent on clothing for a poor prisoner, and those of the Suprema, in 1690, have an item of 688 reals devoted to the same purpose. We have seen that warrants for arrest ordered beds to be brought with the prisoner, as the Inquisition did not furnish them, in accordance with an order of 1525, which assumes that this was to relieve the hardships of those brought from a distance. Yet even in the financial pressure of the 17th century, we find in the accounts of the Madrid Tribunal in 1659 an order, July 11th, to the receiver to pay 230 reals for the hire of beds for poor prisoners up to July 15th. Even more noteworthy are some entries arising from the trial in Madrid of Francisco de Matas in 1680–81. He seems to have had 5 children for whose support was spent, in about a year from September 1680, 3,519 reals, of which 1,284 were paid to the Hospicio Real de Pobres for its care of 3 of them during sickness. The tribunal evidently felt itself obliged to take care of the helpless children, and such incidents serve to show that when the inquisitors had humanitarian instincts, there was nothing in the policy of the Holy Office to prevent their full manifestation. It is remarkable that, during the period of most active work, there seems to have been no general settled system of defraying the maintenance of prisoners. There is no provision for it in the instructions of 1484, but in Torquemada's supplementary orders of December, the receivers required to pay the expenses. Yet we have seen that immediately after this, the alguazil was in receipt of a salary equal to, or more than, that of the inquisitors, because, as Ferdinand said, he had to meet the great charge of the prisoners, "Tien tan gran costo con los presos," and as we find this in the salary lists of Saragossa, Burgos, Medina del Campo, and Seville, it would seem to be a general rule, while the instructions of 1498 appear to show it still in force. Yet the accounts of the Valencia Tribunal in 1497–98 indicate that the maintenance of those who had property was drawn from the sequestrations, while the pobres miserables, presos en las cárceles, were supported by outside friends or kindred, who were subsequently reimbursed by the receiver. The per diem was 9 dineros for men and 8 for women, while Ali Divit, a Moor and presumably abstemious, was reckoned at 5. A letter of Ferdinand in 1501, authorizing the receiver of Sardinia to include among his disbursements the cost of maintaining prisoners, would indicate that this was becoming the rule, but another letter of the same date calling for reimbursement to Anton Lopez, a yeoman of his guard, who had been ordered by an inquisitor to support certain prisoners, shows that no definite system was as yet established. These irregular methods afforded opportunity for embezzlement and extortion, resulting doubtless in much suffering among the captives. The memorials of Llerena and Jaen in 1506 complain of a conspiracy among the officials to cut down the rations, and that only 10 maravedis a day were allowed, from which 2 were deducted for shaving, linen, and cooking, when 25 or 30 were required, at current prices, for bread alone. At length, the alcaide or jailer appears as the official handling the funds when, in 1510, Ferdinand ordered Velasquez, the receiver of Seville, to pay him 5,000 maravedis because he had fed the prisoners during a time of pestilence. This was evidently an exceptional case arising from an emergency, but it was adopted in 1516 and 1517, in some instructions of the Suprema to the Tribunal of Sicily, where there were sequestrations, the amount was to be drawn from them. In cases of extreme poverty, the cost of a moderate diet could be defrayed from the receiver from the confiscations. Nearly 40 years had passed since the founding of the Inquisition, years of intense activity, and as yet no regular system had been adopted in a matter so important. The necessity was felt, and, in 1518, an order was issued in the name of Charles LEA, which shows that kindred or friends of the prisoner had been expected to bring his food to the prison. The order recites that, as they come from all parts of the district and are far from their families and property, they suffer greatly. Therefore, in the case of non-residents of the city, the receiver is to pay for food and necessities, under instructions from the inquisitor. An account is to be kept with each prisoner, and, if he is discharged, he shall repay the receiver before his sequestration is lifted. If he is poor, he shall not be asked for it, and the auditor shall pass the item in the receiver's accounts. The liberality of this clause seems to have been a novelty, and it took some time to establish the duty of the Inquisition to prevent its poor prisoners from starving. For we find the Queen Regent, in 1531, authorizing their maintenance at Barcelona at the expense of the fisc. Yet this was not held as relieving the family from supporting, as far as possible, an imprisoned member. The account of the dispensero, or steward, of the Valencia prison, from October 8, 1540, to May 5, 1541, shows that during that period there were 25 prisoners thus supported, at least partially, husbands paying for wives, wives for husbands, sons for fathers, etc. The sums received were small and suggest the struggle endured by families to contribute to the necessities of those in jail. They were paid in trifling amounts of from 5 sueldos, 5 dineros, to 8 sueldos, 8 dineros, representing probably a monthly assessment. And this was by no means continuous, for in 8 cases only one payment is recorded, and in only one case is there more than 2 payments. For the whole period, the aggregate is only 15 libras, 19 sueldos, 4 dineros, while during this time the steward obtained from the receiver 120 libras, 2 sueldos, which probably included what the fisc had to pay and what was drawn from the sequestrations of the wealthier prisoners. With regard to the latter, the rule was to sell the personal property first and then the real estate, and inquisitors were urged in 1547 to be prompt in collecting from the proceeds, as the sequestrations were apt to be consumed in supporting the family, leaving nothing to repay the fisc for its advances. It was the duty of the inquisitor, when a prisoner was brought in, to ascertain from the receiver and notary of sequestrations his station in life and his wealth, and to fix the amount of his allowance in accordance with the current prices of provisions. But a wealthy man could spend more if he chose, and, if a person of quality wished to have 1 or 2 servants incarcerated with him, as in the case of Carranza, this was permitted. What might be left over from their table was to be given to the poor, and not to be made a source of profit to the alcaide and dispensero. There was liberality in this, as, in case of confiscation, the estate was diminished by the extra expenditure. Even the ordinary allowance was at the disposition of the prisoner, who could economize on it and spend it in any manner that he chose. Thus, there was never at any time a fixed and absolute ration, although of course there was a general minimum standard for the poor who had to be supported. Whatever it was liable to alteration, as circumstances might dictate. After Jacques Pinzon was imprisoned in Granada, February 25, 1599, on March 9th, the alcaide reported that he consumed in one day the ration of 2, and was dying of hunger, whereupon the inquisitors kindly increased his allowance to a real per day. This kept him quiet for 3 months, when there was a fresh complaint, and 5 maravedis were added. In 1616, Padre Hieromino de la Madre de Dios, tried for mysticism, sought his first audience to complain that his ration was insufficient. He wished it increased by a real a day, which could be charged to his sequestrated property. Evidently, prisoners did not hesitate to make their wants known, and there was a readiness to listen to them. With the gradual concentration of power in the Suprema, it came to regulate this in all the tribunals. In 1635, Valencia reported that, in consequence of the dearness of bread, the prisoners were suffering from hunger, and it asked authority to increase the ration. The Suprema deliberated for 5 weeks and then ordered an increase to be made with great compassion. The close supervision exercised is indicated in 1695 in a criticism on a monthly report from the same tribunal, in which one of the omissions noted is that the ration assigned to each prisoner is not stated. The fall in the purchasing power of money, and especially of the debased Visson coinage, necessitated an increase in the ration. In 1641, at Toledo, the ordinary daily allowance was 1.5 reals, which by 1677 had doubled to 3 reals. In Valencia, the ordinary ration had increased to 22 dineros in 1688, and in 1756 to 2 sueldos. When the prisons were full and the trials, after the first hurried rush, grew more and more protracted, the expense of maintenance was not small, as can be gathered from occasional indications. Thus, in 1566, we find the Suprema ordering its alguazil mayor to remit the Tribunal of Calahorra 400 ducats to defray the food of prisoners. In 1586, Benito Sanguino, the receiver of Valencia, in settling his accounts, claimed credit for 19,856 sueldos paid to this dispensario for the maintenance of poor prisoners, in addition to what he had disbursed for the purpose on the orders of inquisitors, an irregularity for which the Suprema demanded an explanation. Some light is thrown on the way in which these costs accumulated by the case of Fray Lucas de Allende, guardian of the Franciscan convent of Madrid, and one of the dupes of Lucrecia de Leon, a beata revelandera. When arrested in 1590, his brother, Alonso de Allende, asked permission to give him an allowance of a real a day, a request which proved costly, as the trial lasted for 6 years and 2 months. In 1659, the orders given by the Tribunal of Madrid for the food and incidentals of its poor prisoners, who seem to have averaged about 10 in number, reached an aggregate of 12,874 reals, and in 1681 the amount was 25,748. As the activity of the Inquisition diminished, and perhaps also as its resources fell short, this drain on its finances was greatly reduced. In a statement of the expenses of the Valencia Tribunal from 1784 to 1790 inclusive, the charge for maintenance of poor prisoners becomes trifling. The total expenditure during these 7 years was 501 libras, 18 sueldos, of which 300 libras, 8 sueldos, were recovered from the parties, leaving a net outlay of 201 libras, 10 sueldos, or less than 30 libras per annum. The tribunals were unrelenting in the collection of these expenses from all who could be held responsible. In the case of frailes who could own no property, their communities were liable. Thus, in 1649, the Tribunal of Valencia issues an order to collect from the Provincial of the Augustinians 600 reals for certain members of his order who were in its prison. When the trial of Fray Esteban Ramoneda was concluded, September 12, 1696, the Barcelona Tribunal rendered to his order of Merced a bill of 730 reals for his expenses. The Provincial assessed it on all the Mercenarian converts of Catalonia, and, on November 15th, the inquisitors scolded the prior of the Barcelona convent for delay, when he replied that his convent had paid its share but that others were dilatory. In 1709, the Suprema issued an order that there must be no exceptions even to the barefooted Franciscans, showing that they had been endeavoring to procure exemption. The Inquisition was not likely to be more lenient with the laity. Its determination to secure reimbursement is seen in an order of the Valencia Tribunal, in 1636, that when Francisco Morales completes the term of galley service to which he had been condemned, he is to be sold to his neighbors to repay what he had cost to the fisc. These costs were not simply for maintenance in prison, but for expenses attending arrest and trial, including the fees of advocate and procurator and all postage incurred. The whole of this was a first lien on the property of the prisoner, and, if he was a filius familias, his father was liable and could be forced to pay. Before an auto de fe, the dispensero and notary of sequestrations carefully made up the account of every penitent who escaped confiscation, and it was the duty of the fiscal to see that, if he had property, he settled or gave an obligation to settle, and, if he was poor, that he took an oath to pay whenever he should be able. How these accounts were swelled is visible in that rendered by the Barcelona Tribunal in 1756 to Don Antonio Adorno, a soldier of gentle blood in the regiment of Asturias. He was only 58 days in prison, which, at 2 sueldos a day, amounted to a little less than 6 libras, but the aggregate of the bill was 26. He subscribed his name to this as accurate, stating that he had no property with which to meet it, but that, if God should grant him better fortune, he obligated himself to pay it to the receiver or his duly authorized representative. As his sentence was banishment from the Spanish dominions, this was a pure formality, but it could not be omitted. A few months later we have a piteous letter from Dr. Agustin Tamart, a physician of the town of Salas, whose enemies had involved him with the Inquisition, resulting in a charge against him of 5 libras 16 sueldos. In reply to a demand for payment, he protests that he is miserably poor. During this enforced absence, his colleague, Dr. Rubert, had collected from the town the conducta, or stated salary, due to both, and refuses to pay over his share. If the tribunal will compel Rubert to settle, he will endeavor to sell some wheat and satisfy the account. On the whole, we may conclude that the secret prisons of the Inquisition were less intolerable places of abode than the episcopal and public jails. The general policy respecting them was more humane and enlightened than that of other jurisdictions, whether in Spain or elsewhere, although negligent supervision allowed of abuses, and there were ample resources of rigor and reserve, when the obstinacy of the impenitent was to be broken down. The one unpardonable feature was the seclusion which kept the unhappy captive ignorant of all that occurred outside of its prison walls, and deprived him of facilities for defense and of communication with family and friends. This rendered doubly bitter the prolonged detention which often held him for years in suspense as to their fate, and deprived them of all knowledge as to him. End of Book 6, Chapter 4, Part 3. Recording by Angie Liu.